Brentwood had wealth, gates, private security, and a murder rate low enough to make violence feel almost theoretical. Then, one of its most successful residents was killed inside the kind of home people buy because they believe the outside world cannot reach them there. The city sits roughly 20 minutes from Nashville, Tennessee, close enough for residents to reach the restaurants, offices, and music venues of the state capital, far enough away to feel private. With a population of around 40,000, Brentwood has long ranked among the wealthiest communities in Tennessee and among the most affluent in the United States. Household incomes sit well above the national average. Landscaped neighborhoods spread across rolling green hills. There are upscale stores, restaurants, more than 10 parks, and private recreational facilities built for people who can afford distance from ordinary city life. Prominent musicians, actors, athletes, executives, and politicians have all been drawn to the area. Famous residents have included Taylor Swift, Nicole Kidman, and Keith Urban, Jack White, and Carrie Underwood and Mike Fisher. But celebrity was only part of Brentwood's appeal. The bigger attraction was security. Crime there was reported to be roughly 74% below the national average. Since Brentwood's incorporation in 1969, the city had recorded only a small number of murders. 8, according to the figures cited at the time. In a place like that, violent crime can start to feel like something that happens elsewhere. And the Maidens family lived behind another layer of protection. Their home stood in the Governor's Club, an exclusive gated development covering approximately 600 acres around a private golf course designed by Arnold Palmer. Access was largely restricted to residents and their invited guests. It was the kind of community where the entrance itself delivered a message. The public world stopped at the gate. Inside was the home shared by Dr. Raikel Maidens, her husband, Randolph Randy, Carrie Maidens, and their 2-year-old daughter, Natalie. The residence measured roughly 500 square meters and was valued at around $1 million. It had the scale and polish of a home built to represent arrival. And in many ways, Raikel really had arrived. She was 34 years old in April 2013, a successful orthodontist with her own private practice in Brentwood's Maryland Farms business district. She was also a published professional and a sought-after conference speaker. But if you look only at the resume, you miss the amount of work behind it. Rachael attended Father Ryan High School, a Catholic school in Nashville, before enrolling at Birmingham Southern College in Alabama. There, she distinguished herself both academically and athletically. She became a standout member of the tennis team, earned major athletic and academic recognition, and graduated magna cum laude with a bachelor's degree in biology and psychology. She also received the prestigious Dineheiser Scholarship. Then came the University of Florida College of Dentistry. Rachael earned her Doctor of Dental Surgery degree and served as president of her class, a role that reflected both academic ability and the leadership qualities people around her had already noticed. After dental school, she completed an orthodontics residency at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. By her early 30s, she had built what takes many professionals much longer to achieve: advanced training, her own clinic, recognition from colleagues, published work, and invitations to speak publicly about her field. Then there was Natalie. Rachael adored her daughter. In family photographs, she appears not only as a doctor and business owner, but as a young mother in the middle of a life that seemed to be expanding. The available portraits show professional success, travel, parenthood, and a smiling couple. They capture real moments. What they cannot capture is everything happening outside the frame. That distinction matters here. The education was real. The career was real. The home and family were real. The smiles may have been real in the seconds when the camera recorded them. But still, images cannot tell you what a marriage feels like after the photograph is taken. Rachael had already lived through a family crisis that became both public and deeply personal. On December 3, 2003, while she was still a student, federal agents arrested her father, Dr. Richard Frisbee, a respected pharmacist. He was accused of selling the prescription painkiller OxyContin to an informant working with the Drug Enforcement Administration. Authorities also alleged that he had been illegally selling prescription medication from his home. The allegations never reached trial. 2 days after his arrest, Richard Frisbee died by suicide. For Rachael's family, his death did not end the ordeal. During the investigation, authorities froze bank accounts connected not only to Richard, but also to Rachael, her mother, and her brother. The surviving relatives found themselves financially entangled in an investigation centered on the actions of a man they had just lost. That process continued for years. Raikel and the other family members were ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, and her mother reportedly received $15,000 in compensation from police. But compensation is an accounting measure. It says nothing about what it is like to lose a parent without warning, face public scrutiny, and then have access to family money restricted while trying to continue an education. We should be careful not to turn that experience into a convenient psychological explanation for everything Raikel did afterward. We cannot know precisely how it shaped her or what she told herself in private. What we do know is what followed. She stayed in school, completed demanding professional training, and built a career that gave her both status and financial independence. By 2013, Rachael's life appeared highly structured. Randy's background looked accomplished as well. Randolph Carey Maidens was born to Charles and Barbara Maidens in St. Louis, Missouri. He spent much of his childhood in Georgia, graduated from Wheeler High School in Marietta, and later attended Georgia Tech. As an adult, he worked in pharmaceutical or biotechnology sales. Around the time of his marriage to Rachael, he held a sales management position with a Brentwood-based company involved primarily in oncology research. Some later accounts suggested that Randy may no longer have been employed there by the time Rachael died, although that detail was never officially confirmed. The company declined to discuss the matter after the killing. There are also conflicting identifiers in some summaries of this case. One supplied brief calls Raikel's husband, Michael, gives her age as 47, and places the house in Glenwild. The author's case material identifies him as Randolph Randy Maidens, gives Raikel's age as 34, and places the family in the Governor's Club. Those discrepancies require verification, but the account followed here is the one naming Randy and locating the family in the Governor's Club. On paper, then, the Maidens family fit their surroundings: 2 educated adults, a young daughter, a successful medical practice, and an expensive home inside one of Brentwood's most exclusive communities. The polished image was not necessarily fake. That is what makes this story so unsettling. It concealed something far more complicated: a marriage entering a period of instability, and a husband whose behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. 3 months before Rachael died, strangers in a restaurant saw the warning signs spill into public view. Randy was heavily intoxicated. Medication fell from his pocket, and police found a shotgun in his vehicle. The first major warning did not happen behind closed doors. It happened in a restaurant, in front of employees who were frightened enough to call 911 twice. This was January 2013, roughly 3 months before Raikel Maidens was killed. Randy reportedly entered the restaurant extremely intoxicated. Not slightly impaired, not just loud after a few drinks. His condition was alarming enough that patrons noticed, employees became uneasy, and one waitress found herself trapped between 2 bad options. She did not feel comfortable serving him more alcohol, but she was also afraid that if she refused, he might leave, get into his car, and drive away. So she called 911. Before officers arrived, the situation became even more disturbing. Randy stood up, and several objects reportedly fell from his pocket. Among them, the employees saw what appeared to be a shotgun shell and a large medicine bottle that looked like Tylenol. That changed the urgency of the call. The waitress contacted 911 again, this time even more frightened than before. Now, she was not simply dealing with a heavily intoxicated customer. She was dealing with a man who appeared disoriented, who might have access to a firearm, and who seemed ready to leave before police could reach the restaurant. According to the account, Randy did try to go. The employee persuaded him to wait. Think about the position she was in for a second. She had no way of knowing whether the shotgun shell meant anything. She did not know what was inside the bottle, whether Randy had taken anything from it, or whether the bottle was connected to his condition at all. What she did know was that his behavior frightened her, and that letting him walk into the parking lot felt dangerous. When officers arrived, they searched Randy's vehicle. Inside, they found a shotgun. And yet, Randy was not arrested in connection with the incident. There may have been legal or procedural reasons for that decision that were never fully explained in the available account. Possessing a firearm, by itself, does not automatically prove that someone has committed a crime, nor does the presence of a medicine bottle establish drug abuse. But put yourself in the room. An apparently intoxicated man causes enough concern for 2 emergency calls. A shotgun shell falls from his pocket, and police then locate a shotgun in his vehicle. The episode ended without a lasting intervention. During the disturbance, Randy reportedly made one request several times. He did not want the waitress to call Raikel. According to him, his wife would be angry. It would be easy to take that line and build an entire marriage around it. To imagine Randy as a frightened husband trying to avoid another argument, or Raikel as someone who had grown exhausted from repeatedly cleaning up his messes. But one statement from an intoxicated man cannot tell us what happened inside their home. Randy's description of Raikel's anger was his description. It was not independent proof of who she was or how their marriage worked. What happened next, though, is worth holding on to. Raikel reportedly came to collect him. So only months before she was killed, she was placed in the role of managing the consequences of his behavior. The restaurant staff had called police. Officers had found the shotgun. But it was Raikel who was apparently summoned to take Randy home. And the restaurant was not the only place where people noticed something was wrong. A neighbor named Cynthia Rosenblum later described seeing Randy wandering through wooded areas around nearby homes. In her account, his face was masked or otherwise obscured, making the sight even more unsettling. When Rosenblum and her husband asked what he was doing, Randy reportedly struggled to speak clearly. He appeared intoxicated, impaired, or badly disoriented. His explanation was that he had been walking dogs and had become lost. Maybe that was true. But in a gated neighborhood where residents expected to recognize the people moving around their properties, the explanation did little to make the encounter feel normal. A man wandering near homes, with his appearance partly concealed and his speech difficult to understand, was not something the neighbors simply forgot. Then there was another reported incident in March, this time in Florida. A trespassing case was opened involving Randy shortly before Raikel's death. The available record is limited, and the case was later closed after his arrest on the murder charge. That means we should be careful here. We do not know precisely what Randy was accused of doing in Florida, what evidence existed, or whether the allegation would ever have resulted in a conviction. Still, it became one more entry in a troubling sequence. The restaurant, the shotgun, the woods, the neighbor's concern, the Florida trespassing allegation. There were also questions about Randy's professional life. He had worked as a sales manager for a Brentwood biotechnology company involved primarily in oncology research. Reports later suggested that he may no longer have been employed there by the time Raikel was killed. The company did not provide public clarification, so that point remains uncertain. It should not be presented as established fact. The same caution applies to claims that Randy was abusing drugs in addition to alcohol. Witnesses described intoxication and impairment. A large medicine bottle reportedly fell from his pocket. But those facts do not tell us what, if anything, he had consumed beyond alcohol. Suspicion is not a toxicology report. What can be said is narrower and disturbing enough. By early 2013, Randy's behavior had repeatedly drawn concern from people who had no reason to coordinate their stories. Restaurant workers saw one piece of it. Police encountered another. Neighbors saw him wandering near homes. A trespassing allegation surfaced in another state. Alcohol, access to firearms, disorientation, and boundary-crossing behavior kept appearing around the same man. But almost nothing seemed to stick. No single incident led to an intervention that removed the risk. No arrest at the restaurant. No lasting consequence that changed the pattern. Each event could be treated as isolated, explained away, or left unresolved. And here is where the central question becomes more complicated. These episodes may suggest a man deteriorating. They may point toward impulsivity, intoxication, and increasingly erratic behavior. If that were all investigators later found, Raikel's killing might look like the catastrophic end of an uncontrolled collapse. But deterioration alone would not explain everything waiting inside and around the Maidens' home. It would not explain the cash. It would not explain the note. And it would not explain why someone apparently tried to clean blood from the house with bleach. By April, Randy's instability was no longer a private suspicion. Police officers, restaurant employees, and neighbors had each encountered a piece of it. They had seen warning signs separately, never knowing how those pieces would eventually fit together. Then, on April 21st, Raikel's mother made the call that finally sent police to the mansion. She was reportedly worried Randy might kill himself. But when officers arrived, it was Raikel who needed help. No one answered the front door. The curtains were closed, and the house gave officers no sign of life. Then they heard a small child crying somewhere above them. The call that brought Brentwood police to the Maidens' home came from Raikel's mother, Betty Frisbee, on April 21, 2013. Exactly what Betty knew at that moment remains unclear. One account says she told police that her son-in-law, Randy, appeared to be on the verge of suicide. Another says Betty had given him an ultimatum: put Raikel on the phone within 10 minutes, or she would call the police. Those versions differ in an important way. One suggests Betty feared Randy might hurt himself. The other suggests she was already frightened by the fact that she could not speak to her daughter. But we should be careful here. There is no verified account of exactly what Randy may have said to Betty, and it would be wrong to invent one. What is clear is that something about the situation alarmed her enough to request an urgent welfare check. Within minutes, patrol officers arrived at the Maidens' residence. From the outside, the house still looked controlled, expensive, private, the kind of property designed to keep disorder somewhere else. It stood inside an exclusive gated community, surrounded by carefully maintained homes and landscaping. Nothing about that exterior explained why Raikel's mother was so afraid. Officers knocked. No answer. They tried to see through the windows, but the curtains had been drawn throughout the house. That mattered. A welfare check often begins with observation. Is someone moving inside? Is a television on? Is there a person lying on the floor? Here, the officers could see almost nothing. They called out, but again, there was no response. Then they noticed that the garage was open. That gave them a way inside. Once they entered, the officers began calling for the people who were supposed to be there. Raikel? Nothing. Randy? Still nothing. Think about how strange that silence must have felt. Police had been sent there because of an urgent warning from a family member. The garage was open. The house was closed off from view. Neither adult answered. Yet the home was not empty. From the second floor came the sound of a child crying. It was Rachael and Randy's 2-year-old daughter, Natalie. Officer Austin Kern went upstairs toward the sound and found her alive in her crib. She was tearful, alone, and too young to explain what had happened in the rooms below her. For the officers, finding Natalie alive was the first piece of good news. It was also proof that something was deeply wrong. A toddler does not simply remain crying in a crib while both parents ignore police moving through the house and calling their names. One of those parents should have responded. Someone should have come upstairs. Someone should have picked her up. No one did. And then, from the upper level, Kern looked over the balcony railing into the great hall below. That was the moment the welfare check changed. He could see blood. He could also see a shotgun lying on a couch. Until then, there was still room, however small, for an explanation that did not involve a killing. Maybe Randy had left. Maybe Rachael was injured. Maybe someone was unconscious somewhere in the house. The view from that balcony stripped those possibilities away one by one. Officers moved through the first floor and found Raikel in the passage between the living area and the foyer leading toward the primary bedroom. She showed no signs of life. The source account describes her as having been shot from behind, with multiple rounds fired from both a 9mm weapon and a shotgun. The important point at this stage is not a graphic inventory of her injuries. It is the sequence implied by the scene. Rachael had been attacked inside her own home, while her 2-year-old daughter remained upstairs. And there was something else. The house did not look like a scene that had simply been abandoned immediately after an uncontrollable explosion of violence. Officers saw indications that someone had tried to remove blood from the walls or flooring. They could smell bleach. The cleaning had not worked. Traces remained visible. That detail changes the way you look at everything around it. A sudden act can happen in seconds. An argument escalates. A weapon appears. Someone fires. But trying to clean blood requires another decision. It means staying in the house after the violence, finding cleaning supplies, applying them, wiping surfaces, looking at what happened and attempting to alter what the next person will see. Maybe the effort was rushed. Maybe it was incomplete. Either way, the smell of bleach suggested time spent managing the aftermath. And all the while, Natalie was still in the house. That is difficult to sit with. She was alive, physically separated from the scene by one floor, but completely dependent on adults who were no longer caring for her. Whether she had been in the crib during the shooting or placed there afterward was not established in the draft. What mattered legally was that she had been left inside the home during or after her mother's killing. That fact would later form the basis of a child neglect charge. The officers now had 3 immediate priorities: secure Natalie, preserve the scene, and find Randy. Rachel had been located. Natalie was alive. Randy was gone. And because a shotgun had been found inside the house, and because of Randy's recent behavior, police could not safely assume that it was the only weapon involved or that he had left unarmed. This was no longer a quiet call at a mansion. It became a tactical search centered on one of Brentwood's most exclusive communities. Local police were joined by additional resources, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation became involved. Special response officers searched the area. Helicopters were brought overhead. Residents who had chosen the neighborhood for privacy and security suddenly found themselves inside an active manhunt. Police Chief Jeff Hughes publicly described Randy as unstable. That warning was not abstract. Officers knew about the earlier episode in which Randy had appeared heavily intoxicated in public with a shotgun in his vehicle. Now his wife had been found dead, his daughter had been left alone upstairs, and no one knew where he was. Was he fleeing? Was he hiding nearby? Was he still armed? The gates that normally controlled who entered the neighborhood could do little about a danger that might already be somewhere inside them. By the end of those first minutes, police had found the victim, secured the child, and recognized signs of an attempted cleanup. The central uncertainty was no longer whether something terrible had happened. It was where Randy had gone, and what he intended to do next. Then investigators found a message on the kitchen table. It sounded partly like an apology and partly like an accusation. And beside that strange explanation sat evidence suggesting Randy had prepared for more than a moment of panic. A farewell note normally closes a story. Randy's note did the opposite, because it never clearly said he intended to die, and it described a future in which he would still care for his daughter. By the time police found that document on the kitchen table, the search for Randy Maidens had already expanded far beyond the walls of the house. Brentwood police were joined by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Tactical officers moved through and around the gated community. Helicopters searched from above while teams on the ground checked the wooded areas surrounding the property. In a neighborhood designed to keep danger outside, residents were being told that a potentially armed homicide suspect might be hiding among their homes. Police Chief Jeff Hughes publicly described Randy as unstable. Officers had reason to operate cautiously. There were firearms inside the Maidens' home, including the shotgun found on the couch, and Randy's recent behavior had already raised concerns about alcohol, possible drug use, and access to weapons. No one could safely assume he had left the rest of those weapons behind. But while officers searched for the man himself, investigators began finding traces of what he had been thinking, or at least what he wanted others to believe he had been thinking. The note on the kitchen table was long, emotional, and deeply contradictory. Randy apologized to his daughter, Natalie. He told her that he loved her. He thanked members of Raikel's family for the years he had spent with them. And he acknowledged that he had committed some terrible act, though he apparently did not describe that act directly in the note. Those passages sounded like an admission. They also sounded like a goodbye. Then the tone changed. Randy wrote that he had been forced to run because of what he had done. But alongside his apologies, he attacked Raikel's character. He claimed he had endured daily humiliation throughout their 6-year relationship. According to his version, she yelled at him, belittled him, and started arguments over minor issues. He also referred to himself as her third husband and suggested that the 2 men before him had been unable to tolerate her either. Then came his explanation for the final break. One last argument had pushed him beyond what he could endure. We need to be very careful here. Those were Randy's claims. They were written by the man police believed had just killed Raikel, at a moment when she could no longer respond. They were not an independent account of the marriage, and they did not establish that his description of her was true. More importantly, even if every complaint had been accurate, none of it could justify what happened inside that house. Still, the note mattered because it offered investigators a possible glimpse into Randy's state of mind. Was this the story of an argument that exploded into violence, followed by panic? Or was he building a version of events that shifted responsibility toward the woman he had killed? That question became even harder to answer because of what the note did not say. Although it was widely described as a suicide note, It reportedly contained no direct statement that Randy planned to take his own life. In fact, parts of it pointed in the opposite direction. Randy imagined remaining involved in Natalie's future. He expressed a desire to care for her, apparently with help from Raikel's relatives. Think about that contradiction for a second. He was apologizing as though he expected to disappear, yet writing about fatherhood as though some future still existed for him. And then police found the money. Approximately $87,000 in cash was reportedly stuffed into a large bag in the trunk of Randy's car. More than $9,000 was found inside the house. That is not a minor detail. It is the kind of discovery that immediately changes the questions investigators have to ask. Had Randy gathered the money because he intended to flee and begin another life? Was it being kept there for an unrelated reason? Had there been a plan that collapsed once the reality of the killing set in? Or was the cash simply available to him, with no connection to what happened that night? The money alone could not answer any of that. But placed beside the note, the attempted cleanup, and Randy's disappearance, it was difficult to dismiss. He had also made another significant decision on the evening of the killing. Telephone records showed that Randy contacted David Rabin, an experienced Nashville criminal defense attorney. What the two men discussed was not publicly established, and there is no basis to invent the contents of a privileged conversation. The importance lies in the call itself. At some point after Raikel was killed, Randy reached out to someone who understood exactly how a homicide investigation and criminal prosecution could unfold. That suggests at least some degree of awareness, some ability to make a deliberate choice. And yet, if Randy intended to escape, his actions were remarkably ineffective. He appears to have had time. There was cash in his car. Police had not yet sealed off every possible route. He could have driven away before the search reached its full scale. Instead, he remained close to the house. For roughly 12 hours, Randy hid in the wooded area behind the property while officers searched for him. Somewhere beyond the carefully landscaped grounds and million-dollar homes, the primary suspect was moving through the trees close enough that the neighborhood itself became part of the search zone. Residents later reported signs that someone had tried to enter homes and garages. According to the account in the case record, surveillance footage supported those reports and showed Randy moving through the neighborhood, approaching nearby properties and trying doors. But even that behavior can be read in several ways. Was he searching for shelter? Looking for a vehicle or another way out? Was he intoxicated and confused, moving without a coherent plan? Or was this an improvised escape attempt after his original plan had fallen apart? We cannot know which explanation was in his mind. What we do know is that no neighbor opened a door and gave him refuge. In a gated community where residents were accustomed to recognizing one another, Randy had become the danger everyone was trying to keep out. And after approximately 12 hours, the search finally ended. Randy emerged from the woods with his hands raised. He surrendered without a shootout, without taking Natalie, and without making the escape that the cash and parts of his note appeared to suggest he had considered. Police now had their suspect in custody, but they still had two competing pictures of him. One was a man unraveling after a violent explosion, confused, possibly intoxicated, hiding close to home and wandering from door to door without a workable plan. The other was a man who had taken concrete steps after killing his wife, attempting to clean the scene, writing a note that blamed Raikel, gathering or possessing a large amount of cash, contacting a defense attorney, and searching for somewhere to go. The note sounded impulsive. The rest looked disturbingly like decision-making. Randy was charged with first-degree murder, child neglect, and tampering with evidence. The murder charge exposed him to life imprisonment, or even the harshest punishment available under Tennessee law. Yet the next surprise was not a forensic discovery. It was how often the system still allowed him room to move. Randy had been found after an armed manhunt and charged with murdering his wife while their 2-year-old daughter remained inside the house. Less than 2 months later, a judge reduced his bond by $1, $75 million. Think about that timeline. Police discovered Raikel's body on April 21st, 2013. Randy stayed hidden in the woods for roughly 12 hours before emerging with his hands raised. Investigators had already found the weapons, signs that someone had tried to clean blood from the house, the note on the kitchen table, and nearly $87,000 in cash inside his car. The charges reflected the seriousness of what police believed had happened: first-degree murder, child neglect, and tampering with evidence. That first charge mattered. First-degree murder meant prosecutors were not describing Raikel's death as merely an unlawful killing committed during a sudden explosion of anger. They were alleging an intentional, premeditated act, that Randy had formed the decision to kill her before he did it. If convicted as charged, he faced the possibility of life in prison or even execution under Tennessee law. Initially, Randy was held on a $5 million bond. That amount did not make release technically impossible, but it set an extremely high barrier. It reflected the murder accusation, the concern that Randy could be dangerous, and the obvious question of whether a man found hiding after his wife's death might try to disappear if given another chance. Then his defense challenged that interpretation. Randy's attorney, David Rabin, argued that the hours before Randy's arrest actually showed he was not a serious flight risk. If Randy had truly intended to escape, the defense said, he had already possessed the time and opportunity to do it. There was a gap between Raikel's killing and the arrival of police. He could have driven away. He could have put distance between himself and Brentwood. Instead, he remained nearby. The defense also pointed to what investigators apparently did not find. There were reportedly no airline tickets, travel documents, maps, or other obvious preparations for a long-distance escape inside the vehicle. No clear itinerary, no documented destination. Nothing that proved Randy had arranged to leave Tennessee and begin again somewhere else. In June 2013, the argument worked. The judge reduced Randy's bond from $5 million to $750,000. He was subsequently released while awaiting trial for the murder of his wife. Legally, release on bond is not a declaration of innocence. It is not even a prediction about the eventual verdict. A judge is deciding whether conditions can reasonably protect the public and ensure that the defendant returns to court. Still, this was an extraordinary amount of discretion to extend in a case like this. And the defense's explanation left one detail sitting there, unresolved: the cash. The absence of tickets or travel documents did not explain why nearly $87,000 had been packed into Randy's car. Cash does not identify a destination. It does not need a reservation, leave a credit card trail, or tell investigators how it was meant to be used. It could not, by itself, prove that Randy had planned to flee. But it also made the lack of conventional travel preparations less reassuring than the defense suggested. So what did the money mean? Was it part of a plan that Randy abandoned? Was it unrelated to the killing? Or had events inside the house unfolded so chaotically that even Randy no longer knew what he intended to do next? Those were exactly the kinds of questions a trial was supposed to test. But while Randy waited for that trial, his behavior brought him into contact with police again. In December 2013, officers were called to the Avery Park residential complex in Bellevue, another Nashville suburb. Randy had reportedly been moving through the complex and knocking on apartment doors. According to a resident identified in the draft as Avery Park, his behavior was highly unusual. Randy allegedly acted as though he were a police officer, demanded that residents open their doors, and attempted to gain entry. Imagine being on the other side of one of those doors. A stranger is outside. He appears intoxicated. He claims some kind of authority and insists that you let him in. Residents called the actual police. When officers arrived, they reportedly found Randy heavily intoxicated. Yet even though he was awaiting trial on a first-degree murder charge, the immediate allegation from this new encounter was public intoxication. He was released again the following day. That is the part that is difficult to ignore. This was not the first time Randy's conduct had raised alarms. Months before Rachael's death, restaurant employees had been frightened enough to call 911 after he arrived severely intoxicated, with a shotgun shell and what appeared to be a large bottle of medication falling from his pocket. Police found a shotgun in his vehicle, but he was allowed to leave with Rachael. There had also been reports of him wandering through the woods near homes while masked and barely able to explain himself. He claimed he had been walking dogs and become lost. And before the murder, a trespassing case had reportedly been opened against him in Florida, although the available material gives no meaningful detail about what happened there. None of those incidents, by themselves, proves that Randy planned Raikel's murder. They do not justify diagnosing him with any specific condition, and the available record does not establish exactly what substances, if any, were involved beyond alcohol in the documented encounters. But together, they formed a pattern: intoxication, trespassing allegations, weapons, attempts to enter places where he did not belong, and behavior serious enough that strangers repeatedly called police. Again and again, there seemed to be a warning. And again, Randy walked away. Was that because officers and judges saw each incident as isolated and legally minor? Was it because the evidence available at those moments did not support stronger action? Or did Randy's money, social status, and access to experienced legal representation buy him a degree of patience that someone else might not have received? Raikel's family had reason to ask that question. So do we. But it has to remain a question. The available facts do not prove a conspiracy or establish that officials deliberately favored Randy because he was wealthy. What they do show is a series of discretionary decisions, and a family watching the man accused of killing Raikel remain free while awaiting trial. After the Bellevue arrest, prosecutor Kim Helper moved to revoke Randy's bond in the murder case. The argument was straightforward. Whatever the immediate charge from the apartment complex, this new incident violated the conditions under which he had been released. This time, the court agreed. The second arrest finally ended Randy's freedom before trial. For Raikel's family, however, detention was not the larger reckoning. That was still supposed to happen in a public courtroom. Prosecutors would have to defend their claim of premeditation. The alleged cleanup inside the house could be examined. So could the weapons, the note, the cash, and Randy's accusations that Raikel had humiliated him throughout their marriage. The surviving records available here do not provide a complete trial file. And without independent verification, claims about a staged home invasion, detailed digital evidence, a specific financial motive, or proceedings continuing through 2016 cannot simply be treated as established fact. But there was already more than enough for a jury to confront. Rachael's family expected to hear that evidence challenged in public. They expected Randy's account of their daughter, sister, and mother to be tested rather than allowed to stand unanswered. That trial was scheduled for September 29, 2014. 2 weeks before the jury was due to hear the case, Randy made a decision that ensured they never would. A guilty plea can answer who committed a killing while leaving almost every question about why and how unresolved. Randy Maidens admitted murdering Raikel, but he did it only after prosecutors agreed not to take the original first-degree murder charge before a jury. The timing mattered. His trial was scheduled to begin on September 29, 2014. Then, roughly 2 weeks before that date, the case changed course. Randy accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and child neglect, and the first-degree murder trial that everyone had been preparing for simply never happened. That distinction can sound technical. It wasn't. A first-degree murder trial would have required prosecutors to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Raikel's killing was premeditated. In plain English, the jury would have had to decide whether Randy formed the intent to kill her before he acted. Not merely in the instant of the shooting, but with enough time for reflection under Tennessee law. That would have placed every disturbing detail under a microscope. The weapons. The attempt to clean blood with bleach. The note that blamed Rachael while imagining a future for Randy and Natalie. The approximately $87,000 packed into a bag in his car. The money left inside the house. His call to an experienced criminal defense attorney. His attempts to enter neighboring homes. And finally, the decision to remain hidden in the woods behind the property rather than drive away. Were those the chaotic actions of a man unraveling after an explosive act? Or were they pieces of a plan that failed? A jury never had to answer that question. By accepting second-degree murder, Randy admitted that he had unlawfully killed Rachael. But the agreement removed the need for the state to prove premeditation at trial. And that is what a plea deal does. It creates certainty by giving up the search for a complete courtroom answer. Randy received a sentence of 25 years in prison. The author's draft notes that second-degree murder under Tennessee law could have carried a substantially longer maximum sentence, up to 60 years, making 25 years feel especially limited to Raikel's family. There is an important technical point here. A sentence imposed by a judge is not always the same thing as the number of calendar years a person ultimately remains incarcerated. Violent offenses can carry strict service requirements. Time already spent in custody may count toward the sentence. Certain sentence reduction credits may affect calculations without functioning like ordinary parole. Those are separate questions, and they should not be collapsed into a single claim that Randy would automatically serve every day of the full 25 years. Or, in the other direction, that he was guaranteed release at some particular earlier date. The available material establishes the sentence, 25 years. It also establishes that Randy had already spent time in custody. It does not, by itself, provide a verified release date or enough detail to calculate his exact eligibility status. For Betty and Brent Frisbee, though, the argument was larger than corrections policy. Prosecutors said they accepted the agreement largely for Natalie's sake. A murder trial could have stretched on, reopening the details of Raikel's death through testimony, photographs, forensic evidence, and competing legal narratives. Appeals or other proceedings might have extended the ordeal even further. Natalie had already lost her mother. Her father was responsible. The prosecution's position was that forcing the family, and eventually the child, to endure a long public trial risked creating another layer of trauma. Rachael's family accepted the judgment for Natalie, but accepting it was not the same as believing the punishment was just. In their victim impact statement, Betty and Brent described a grief that no sentencing calculation could capture. Raikel's death had affected her family, friends, colleagues, and patients. But the deepest consequences would be carried by Natalie, Betty, and Brent. Their central point was devastatingly simple. Randy's punishment could be measured in a fixed number of years. Their absence could not. Natalie would grow up without her mother. Betty would live without her daughter. Brent would live without his sister. Add those years together. The birthdays, graduations, ordinary phone calls, family gatherings, and moments when Raikel should have been there. And the total would reach far beyond the term Randy had been given. 25 years had an ending. Their loss did not. The family called Rachael's murder cowardly and brutal. They said the sentence was far too light compared with the cruelty of the crime and the damage left behind. They made clear that they would not otherwise have supported such an agreement. Their acceptance came from concern for Natalie, not forgiveness of Randy and not satisfaction with the result. Then the court heard from Randy. His defense attorney, David Rabin, read a statement on his behalf. It began with an apology to Betty. Randy acknowledged that she was enduring the worst pain a mother could experience, and that he was the cause of it. He said she had welcomed him into the family and that he had destroyed that family. He apologized to Natalie, admitting that his actions had taken away her mother and effectively cost her both parents. He told her that she had been the most important person in Raikel's life. He apologized to Brent for taking his sister. And he addressed Raikel, saying he had promised to love and protect her but had betrayed that promise instead. Read on its own, it sounded like remorse. But it could not be separated from the note police found inside the house. In that earlier message, Randy had complained about Raikel's character. He portrayed himself as someone who had endured years of arguments, humiliation, and belittlement. Even after she was dead, he was constructing a version of events in which her behavior explained his. Now, in court, the language had changed. He accepted blame. He described himself as the person who had destroyed two families. So which version was real? Maybe the courtroom apology reflected genuine remorse after more than a year of confronting what he had done. Maybe it was strategic language offered at the moment of sentencing. Maybe both things were true at once. Regret mixed with self-interest. Guilt mixed with an old desire to blame Raikel. The record cannot open Randy's mind and tell us. And because there was no trial, the public never received the evidentiary narrative that prosecutors and defense attorneys would have built. Witnesses were not tested before a jury. The meaning of the cash, the cleanup, the weapons, and Randy's behavior afterward was never resolved through a verdict on premeditation. The plea removed the most basic doubt. Randy accepted criminal responsibility for killing Raikel, but it also closed the courtroom door before a jury could decide whether he had prepared to do it. The sentence settled Randy's legal future, but another future had to be constructed immediately. The life of a child whose mother was dead and whose father had admitted causing it. Natalie survived because officers heard her crying upstairs. Survival, however, was only the first fact in a childhood reshaped by decisions she had no part in making. She was 2 years old when her mother was killed downstairs and her father disappeared into the woods behind their home. By the time the legal case ended, Randy Maidens had admitted responsibility and accepted a 25-year prison sentence. Natalie had effectively lost both parents from her daily life. Her grandmother, Betty Frisbee, became her guardian. There is no reason to follow Natalie beyond that point or turn the private details of her childhood into another chapter of this case. She was not a witness who chose to enter a courtroom. She was a child left inside the consequences of an adult's actions. What matters here is that Betty, already grieving the murder of her daughter, also assumed responsibility for raising Raikel's daughter. The plea agreement included one practical provision for Natalie's future. The property Randy and Rachael had acquired during their marriage was to be transferred for her benefit. It could not return her mother. It could not restore the family life she had known inside that Brentwood home. But it was intended to give her at least some financial security after both parents had been removed from her everyday world. That provision helps explain why Raikel's family reluctantly accepted the prosecution's position. They were thinking about a child who had already endured enough. A trial could have lasted far longer, exposed the family to repeated public testimony, and forced the circumstances of Raikel's death back into Natalie's life again and again. But accepting the deal did not mean the family believed 25 years was enough. Betty and Raikel's brother, Brent, made their disappointment unmistakable. Their statement described a loss that would outlast Randy's punishment. Years Natalie would live without her mother, years Betty would live without her daughter, and years Brent would live without his sister. From their perspective, the sentence was painfully small beside the life that had been taken. That reaction deserves to stand on its own. It does not prove that Randy's money, social position, or access to an experienced attorney purchased the outcome. What the record shows is more specific. Prosecutors reduced the charge from first-degree murder to second-degree murder. Randy pleaded guilty, and the state avoided a trial in which it would have been required to prove its full theory to a jury. The family accepted that decision for Natalie's sake. They did not pretend to be satisfied by it. And this is where Raikel herself needs to return to the center of the story. Look at her portraits from before April 2013. Look at the photograph of Raikel with Natalie. For a moment, set aside the mansion, the police search, the weapons, and the courtroom agreement. The woman in those images had an identity long before her name became attached to a murder case. She was a daughter and a sister, a mother, a gifted student who graduated magna cum laude in biology and psychology, a class president in dental school, an orthodontist who completed specialized training at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. She built her own practice, wrote for professional publications, spoke at conferences, and earned the trust of patients and colleagues. She had also survived a devastating family crisis years earlier, when her father died by suicide shortly after his arrest and her family's finances became entangled in the investigation that followed. Rachael kept going. She completed her education, built a profession, and created an independent life. Those are not background details to rush through before reaching the crime. They are part of what was destroyed. A murder case has a way of reducing a person to the final day of her life. Rachael becomes the victim, frozen inside the hallway where police found her. But her family, friends, patients, and colleagues knew the years that came before that hallway. Natalie knew her as her mother. That life, not Randy's apology and not his sentence, is the measure of the loss. So what can we say with certainty about how it ended? We know Randy's behavior had become increasingly troubling in the months before the killing. Alcohol was repeatedly involved. There were encounters with police, incidents of trespassing, and access to firearms. We know Rachael was killed inside the home she shared with him. We know someone attempted to clean blood from parts of the scene using bleach. We know Randy left a note on the kitchen table. In it, he apologized, blamed years of conflict, and described the final argument as a breaking point. But the note did not clearly say that he intended to die. Instead, it referred to a future in which he still imagined caring for Natalie. We know approximately $87,000 in cash was found inside his car, packed into a bag. More cash remained in the house. We know Randy did not drive away. He disappeared into the nearby woods, remained in the area during the search, and emerged roughly 12 hours later with his hands raised. And ultimately, we know he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and child neglect. But the plea closed the case before several harder questions could be tested publicly. What was the exact sequence inside the house? What happened immediately before Raikel was shot? Was there one sudden trigger? Or had Randy been moving toward violence for days, weeks, perhaps longer? Why was so much cash waiting in his car? Was it packed before the killing or afterward? What did he intend to do with it? And if Randy planned to escape, why did he remain close enough to be found in the woods behind the neighborhood? Panic may explain it. Intoxication may explain it. A collapse of whatever plan he had may explain it. The available record does not let us choose confidently among those possibilities. There is also the call to his attorney, David Rabin. We know the call occurred. We do not know what was said, and attorney-client privilege means that conversation does not become public simply because people are curious about it. This brings us back to the question running through the entire case. Was Raikel's murder an explosive act committed by a man in collapse, or had Randy prepared to kill her and begin another life? The evidence allows only a partial answer. His conduct after the shooting included purposeful acts. There was an attempted cleanup. There was a written note that shifted blame toward Rachael. There was a large amount of cash in his vehicle. There was concealment in the woods. Those details are difficult to dismiss as one uninterrupted instant of rage. But purposeful behavior after a killing is not, by itself, proof that the killing was planned beforehand. Because Randy pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, prosecutors never had to prove premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury. The defense never had to challenge that theory in a full trial. Witnesses were not examined in open court on every disputed point. The identity of Raikel's killer was resolved. The question of planning was not. Brentwood's gates could control who entered the neighborhood. Its wealth could provide space, privacy, and the appearance of safety. But no gate could reveal what was happening within a marriage, and no security system could control the danger already inside the house. Randy's conviction placed him in the custody of the Tennessee Department of Correction under the 25-year sentence imposed in this case. Any current incarceration status or release eligibility should be taken from the department's latest official record, because those dates can change through sentence calculations and later administrative updates, not through guesswork. Legally, the case ended with a guilty plea. Betty became Natalie's guardian, and the marital property was assigned for Natalie's benefit. Raikel's killer was identified, convicted, and sentenced. But two objects still sit at the center of the unanswered part of this story. A note on the kitchen table blamed a final argument. A bag in the car held nearly $87,000 in cash. One suggests an explosion. The other suggests preparation for whatever came next. So what do you think? Did the plea agreement appropriately protect Natalie from a longer and more painful trial? Or did it deny Raikel's family and the public the fuller accounting that a jury trial might have provided? And based on the note, the cleanup, and the cash, do you believe Randy planned to kill Rachael, or planned only after he had already done it? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to follow more carefully researched true crime stories, subscribe to the channel.